Well, as the committee can see that we have appointments.
Surprise.
We have appointments before the Committee for Advice and Consent. And the first one is for John C. Revens Jr., Vice Marion S. Gold, Ph.D., to the Public Utilities Commission for a term expiring March 1st, 2027. And I'd like to bring to the committee's attention that we have received some communications. I understand that everyone has received the communication from the Lieutenant Governor. I have talked with the Senate President, and he would like to have the opportunity to bring the Lieutenant Governor and Mr. Revens together for a meeting. So today we will hear the testimony, but we will make a motion to hold the appointment until a later date, until the Lieutenant Governor has the opportunity to meet with Mr. Revens and the Senate President. So with that, I'd like to begin with asking former Senator Revens to address the committee if he would like, and then we will see if we have some witnesses to speak on his behalf. Senator Revens, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairperson. It's an honor to be here today. I'm very impressed that you and your colleagues have turned out in such large numbers on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Thank you for that. I'd like to thank Governor Raimondo for this nomination. It's an honor to receive it and to have you, bitch. Excuse me?
Oh my goodness.
Somebody's got their mic off.
Right, we want to make sure everyone is muted, except for Mr. Revens at this time.
I'm sorry. So it's an honor to be nominated by the governor to serve in this very important and responsible position. I hope to have the opportunity to earn your trust, respect, and support for this nomination. And I'm excited for the opportunity to serve our state and our community as I have a number of times in the past. I come before you this afternoon as a consumer, as a business person, as a lawyer, as a former legislator. I began my governmental career in 1965 when Eleanor Slater, who was my state representative, sent me a note to fill out an application and become a page in the Rhode Island House of Representatives. I had never set foot inside the building, but I had campaigned with Mrs. Slater in a couple of her election campaigns when I was a high school student, and she took a liking to me and invited me to serve as her page. It was an extraordinary time in the world in the 60s and in government. And I kind of became of age during those next several years in the State House. I became assistant head page and then head page. In that time, I graduated from the Community College of Rhode Island. And when I was a junior at Providence College in the spring of 1968, I resigned as head page and ran for state representative. My sponsor, Mrs. Slater, had moved on to the Senate, and I ran against an incumbent Republican and won the House seat at the age of 21. At that time, I was the youngest legislator, not only in Rhode Island, but in the United States. I completed my studies at Providence College, applied to one law school, Suffolk University, because they had a night program in Boston, enrolled at Suffolk, and commuted to Boston 3 nights a week for 4 years during my law degree. While I was doing that, I served 3 terms in the House. I worked as a waiter at Rocky Point Park. I worked in sales for a couple of different companies, and I was a substitute teacher in the Providence school system primarily at Roger Williams, but also at Nathan Bishop, Green, Central, Classical, and Hope. And each summer I had to take 6 education credits to keep my temporary teaching certificate so that I'd have that part-time job along with being a waiter while I was serving in the House and going to law school. In the House, I was a strong advocate for 18-year-old majority and saw that legislation through the process to passage. In 1971, the Brown University came forward with a request to expand their 5-year Master's in Biological Science program into a medical school. The legislature created a commission to study the feasibility of that proposal because Brown wanted the state to fund it with an appropriation that would rise to $1 million annually. I was appointed to that commission. I was unanimously elected the chair of that commission, and I and Dr. Cannon and John Cunningham wrote the report that the commission unanimously adopted that recommended that Brown expand into the medical school degree program and that the state fund that proposal to the tune initially of $200,000 a year, as I said, eventually rising to $1 million a year. That proposal was very controversial in the legislature. There were a lot of legislators who felt that Brown was not a real part of the Rhode Island community. They were very skeptical of the university's motives. They felt that the college up on the hill wasn't involved enough in the community. And of course, at the same time, many of the Brown students and college students from throughout Rhode Island and throughout the nation were vigorously protesting our government. It took a lot of hard work to put that together and get it through. And to this day, I think it's one of the most important things that the legislature ever did in supporting Brown in that effort, that we have the wonderful medical community that we have today, the high quality of care, and all the jobs that that decision and that foresight has created. I also became a member of the New England Board of Higher Education in the early 70s, and by 1977, I think I was the chairman of that board for the next at least 4 years. I finished law school in 1974. I ran for an open Senate seat and was elected to the state Senate. I served there from 1974 until an unsuccessful race for general treasurer in a Democratic primary in 1988. In 76, I became the Senate Majority Whip. In 1980, I became the Senate Judiciary Chairman. And in 1983, I became the Senate Majority Leader. The legislation that I was most noted for during those years were, among other things, in the House, electronic roll call voting. We never had votes that were recorded. We never allowed people into the committee meetings unless they were members of the committee. So I was, in my early years, a big advocate for opening up the process. In the early 70s, I became very concerned about the number of children who were being abused and dying in institutions and at the hands of family members who weren't accountable for their safety. And I helped to draft and write and sponsor the legislation that created the Rhode Island Department for Children and Families. It's the only major department of state government that's ever been created by an initiative of a legislator and the legislature rather than the governor. That legislation also established the Office of Child Advocate and the Children's Bill of Rights. I also worked during those years on many, many other important pieces of legislation. One of them was the first law in Rhode Island, which remains on the books to this day, that allows the victim of abuse to go to the district court without having to hire a lawyer and obtain through an affidavit an ex parte restraining order from a judge to protect that person from their abuser. When that was passed in 1981 or 82, there was no other legislation like that in the country. And we were able to get that passed, notwithstanding skepticism from many people as to the need for it, and skepticism from others that we should have let the public get into the court system without having to engage a lawyer. It was certainly groundbreaking legislation at that time. I worked a great deal on economic development issues for the state. I worked on the two pieces of legislation that protect Block Island and Little Compton. We have a real estate transfer tax that funds the Block Island and Little Compton land trusts. Those were passed with my leadership when initially the builders and the realtors and many others opposed transfer taxes because they were afraid that they would become a statewide tax and create an unfair tax burden on property owners. But I was able to persuade them that Little Compton and Block Island were such unique places in Rhode Island and actually in the entire world that it was a worthwhile goal to charge a tax on the transfer of every piece of real estate in order to create a fund to use the money to buy open space. Today, half of the island of New Shoreham, that we all affectionately call Block Island, is now open space that will never be developed. And then lastly, I'll just touch on one other issue. I was the principal advocate and sponsor for the constitutional amendment that did three things that the voters approved. One was to reduce the size of the General Assembly from 150 to 113. The second element of that amendment was to abolish the legislative pensions. And the third element of that amendment was to set a more reasonable compensation system for members of the General Assembly. It took several years of effort on the part of many people, including Phil West and Common Cause and many community groups, to get that on the ballot. And what made it work was the constitutional amendment was prospective in nature, so that my colleagues in the General Assembly weren't going to lose their seat if the amendment passed, because the amendment didn't take effect until the next 10-year census. So it gave a 6 or 8 year window for the legislators who are currently sitting in the Assembly, and the fact that they might have an opportunity to be compensated more fairly helped to get that legislation through the State House onto the ballot, and it won a narrow victory at the polls. So I think my legislative and government record and effort and work is indicative of the kind of energy and foresight I would bring to the commission. When I completed law school in 1973, I opened up a solo law practice in the basement of a law office on Tollgate Road in Warwick that I shared with John Lynch, Joe Walsh, Jerry Cobley, and Mike Higgins. I was a solo practitioner sharing space in that office from the day I passed the bar exam in 1973. In 1977, I relocated from that office space to a building on Centerville Road that I bought with Matos DeLuca. Mr. DeLuca and I formed a partnership, and that legal partnership has endured to this day. Mr. DeLuca changed his practice and went into medical negligence at a different firm, but Sandra Lanny then became my partner, followed by Michael St. Pierre and my brother David. And we've maintained that law partnership from Mr. DeLuca to Miss Lanny until she became a judge, to Mr. St. Pierre and my brother, since 1977. There are 6 lawyers who work in the firm. There are a dozen other people who work in the firm who are non-lawyers. And we have a community-based practice that represents everyone from tenants to injured workers to property owners to small business owners in various aspects of the law. I originally as a young lawyer, was doing more civil litigation, domestic relations, and criminal defense. In the last 20 years or so, my practice is focused on representing small businesses, both in business advice and business transactions, as well as representing property owners before planning and zoning boards and doing wills, trusts, guardianships, probate administration, and things of that nature. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, I served for 4 years as the town solicitor of the town of North Kingstown. Our firm did all of the legal work for the town for 4 years, so I have a significant amount of municipal law experience. I also have been a business owner. In 2015, I acquired sole ownership of Town Line Properties and Town Line Fine Wine and Spirits, which is a liquor store on the Warwick-East Greenwich line on Post Road, about a mile south of Goddard Park entrance. I ran that business with a team for 4.5 years very successfully. We increased the sales of that business by almost 50%. And I received an unsolicited offer last spring to acquire the business, and I sold it at the end of June of 2020 and sold all of the real estate that went with it. But I operated that business with 16 employees from 2015 until June 29th of 2020. Managed the real estate that was part of it, managed all the relationships with the tenants, maintained the property. And I've also, over the years, built a few houses with help from various subcontractors, a couple of which I rented and a couple of which with the help of my brother. 2 of my daughters recently moved into next door to each other in Patuxent Village. I am a father of 3 daughters. I am in a committed relationship with a lady whose name is Elizabeth Sondler, and she has 3 daughters as well. And our adult children have become very good friends over the past years. 3 of them live in the New York City area, 1 lives in Boston, and 2 live in Patuxent Village here in Rhode Island. So for all of the senators who've known me for years, I apologize for talking so long and telling you a lot of things that you've all heard 100 times before. And for all of you who are newer to the committee, I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into my life. I tried to keep it brief and not bore you with a lot of other details, but I'd be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Senator Revens. I've had the privilege to serve with you in the Senate, and I realize that you always had vast experience, and your great legislative accomplishments have helped the state of Rhode Island a great deal. And I know when we initially talked, I was surprised at your energy and your willingness to serve in this capacity. And I appreciate you explaining to the other committee members your background and so forth. You have a wealth, I would say a wealth of experience that could be very helpful in your position. Before we, I do have questions, but I believe you do have a witness today. Is Gary Sass with us today to speak on your behalf? He's not with us? We don't have him here with us, okay?
I know he was trying to, Madam Chair. I know Gary explained that he's a little bit challenged with technology. So I don't know if he had trouble navigating how to sign in or not. Oh, I see now he's joined.
Is he on now?
I think he is. I just saw something on my screen that indicated he's joined.
I think he's trying to call in.
While we're waiting, I neglected to mention that after I lost the primary for treasurer in 1988, I ran for the Senate again in 1990 and won the seat and served an additional 18 years in the Senate until 2008. So I was total service in the House and the Senate between those two periods was 38 years. 20 the first time and 18 the second time. In 2008, I decided not to seek re-election. I didn't want to have my wake in the State House.
Yes, you definitely know your way around the State House. We appreciate your service to the state. So while I don't believe we've made a connection as yet with Mr. Sass, if he does call in, we will revert to him. But I'm going to begin with the questions. I have a few questions for you, and then I will open it up to the floor for the committee members for any questions they may have. So I received several communications opposing your appointment, Jack, and none of them were really on your credentials. They were on the timing of the appointment. And I think we're taking care of that because we're not going to move ahead today. We're going to give the opportunity for that to be fully vetted with the Lieutenant Governor and so forth. But I did receive a communication from the George Wiley Center. And this is a question that has come up before with other PUC appointments. And the question, I wanted to ask you about your support, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, so I'm going to go into it a little bit. Your support for their proposed percentage income payment plan. And it's an approach that exists in over a dozen states. It existed in Rhode Island in the past. Customers, the eligibility, is in the legislation that they would like us to pass. But the eligibility would be for customers with a household income at or below 150% of the federal poverty level. And there would be a subsidy credit amount necessary to reduce the household's home energy burden to an affordable percentage of income. And the bill speaks there would be a certain surcharge on residents' commercial electric accounts, and it would go into a fund, and it would help people who are having difficulty making ends meet. So I guess my first question is, are you familiar with that, and is that something you would be willing to support?
I'm familiar with the fact that it was in the statute in the past, and I believe the commission had the authority in the past to apply that statute. I'm not sure if it's still there now. So I guess my first response would be, if the commission has the authority to do it, then I would listen to the evidence carefully and fully and fairly, and then make a decision based on the facts and the authority of the commission to do it. I'd like to add that the Wiley Center is named after a man whose family was from Warwick. The Wileys are from Warwick. Everyone knows that.
No, they call me a speaker.
And the Wiley Center honors George Wiley, who died tragically in a drowning accident about 50 years ago in Maryland. And George Wiley, the Wiley family's parents, published the only newspaper in Rhode Island for decades that was focused on the minority community. And the Wiley family are icons in Rhode Island, in my opinion. They're one of the finest families to ever live in this state, and I have great respect for the work that the Wiley organization does, but I particularly remember Mr. Wiley, who worked in the post office.
Yes, Beth, they can see it.
And published a newspaper for the black community so that their achievements could be recognized and for all of the many fine things that were happening in the black community in the 50s and 60s when they couldn't get their names or their faces or their stories into the local press. So I have high admiration for the Wiley programs, and I will do what the law tells me to do and authorizes me to do as a commissioner, but I don't know right now whether that statute's still on the books or not.
Okay. Thank you. I do have more questions, but I think we have been joined by Mr. Sass, so I'm going to give him the opportunity to speak on your behalf.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman. You hear
Welcome.
me? Yes. I would very pleased this afternoon to speak on behalf of Jack Revens' appointment to the Public Utilities Commission. I've known and worked with Jack for over 4 decades, and I've been very impressed with his dedication to make government work for all people. And I think that attribute is critically important for anyone that serves on the Public Utilities Commission. Jack's mantra when he worked in the General Assembly, both in the House and Senate, has been to support legislation to help people. I think if you try to define his record and go through the various legislation that he outlined earlier, the common thread is really a desire to make things better and help people, whether it was on creating DCYF to focus on vulnerable children or consumer legislation on unit pricing. There's a very long record of helpfulness. And this approach is particularly important, in my opinion, for someone serving on the Public Utilities Commission, because we need commissioners who will make certain that our utilities are effective, they're efficient, they're economical, and they treat consumers fairly. And I think Jack's record supports those characteristics. The final thing I'll say, Madam Chair, is that in conducting the people's business in all the 44 years I've known Jack, he has maintained the highest ethical standards, and his law practice has received the highest rating for ethical conduct among law firms. He's a person of integrity, and I'm really pleased this afternoon to talk about his outstanding job and highly recommend him for a seat on the PUC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sass. I appreciate you taking the time to join us and give us your comments about Mr. Revens.
I'm sorry about the delay in technology, but I finally caught on.
That's quite all right. Better late than never, as I say.
Thank you.
Do any of the committee members have any questions for this witness? Yes, I think Senator Anderson. And this is just for Mr. Sass.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No?
I'm confused.
Okay. No one has any questions for Mr. Sass. Okay, so we'll go back to, I want to finish my questions for Mr. Revens, if I will, and then I'll open it up to the committee members. I have a curious, we all know that the state of Rhode Island is making a lot of great movements towards being more energy self-sufficient with wind energy, offshore wind energy farms. And I understand this is going to be something that not only the CRMC has been dealing with, but something that PUC will be dealing with, and is not probably dealing with already. But I'm curious, Mr. Revens, if you would like to comment on a couple of things having to do with wind energy. First of all, as I understand it, there will be cables that will be coming into our state waters, making landfall on Rhode Island shore, and these lines will be carrying electricity to Connecticut and Massachusetts. And I'm curious about PUC's authority through this process, and most of all, I am concerned about how these transmission lines will be passing into Connecticut and Massachusetts. How is that going to benefit the state of Rhode Island? I'm curious if this is going to benefit us energy-wise or financially. And I know this is a lot of questions, but things are moving very rapidly, and I know the legislature has every due authority to weigh in on a lot of these issues having to do with electricity transmission, but most of it goes to PUC. But the bottom line is, how will you advocate for ratepayers and assure that the large corporate energy producers properly compensate the state of Rhode Island for this transmission of electricity going across our state?
I think I'd listen to the evidence and determine after hearing it what the value of that access is, assuming the PUC has authority to set that amount. I think Narragansett Bay is the state's greatest natural resource. We've done so much in the past 30 years, especially in the last 10 or 12, to improve the quality of the bay. And I think we have to protect the bay. And number one on the PUC is the same every day. Consumers, consumers, consumers. So we have to make sure that the energy supply is safe, that it's reliable, and that it's affordable. And you can never lose sight of that. So that's the role, is to do what's best for the consumer. It's easy to say that. The challenge is balancing all these new sources of energy as to how they're going to work in both the short term and the long term, and how we work together as a community and as a region in the Northeast to make that happen in the most efficient, affordable, and safe way. That's the job. I don't have the answer to that question, Madam Chair, because I don't know that answer. But I know that, like you asking that question today, it'll be my job to search for that answer and do my best to make sure that we do it appropriately and responsibly.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to open it up to the committee members. I think Senator Anderson had her hand up first, and then Senator Coleman after that.
Yes, thank you. Actually, Chairwoman Sosnowski, you did ask a question that I was going to ask. I also wanted to say that, Mr. Revens, I've been impressed with your work with vulnerable children, with child advocacy, and I hope that you have plans for bringing that forward for those that are vulnerable as far as losing their utilities. And this PIP program is really important in that. So I would hope you would have a commitment to try and support that program, as it's really promoting people taking responsibility for paying their bills, but taking into account that this is extremely stressful, especially at this time. I also wanted just to know what attracted you to this position. What do you feel you are your best attributes that you can bring to the PUC?
I think I try to listen carefully to people when they're asking you to consider doing something, whether it's in the State House or the War Office or in your own house, your own family, and try to make sense out of the facts and the policy, so that I think I'm a good listener. I think I analyze things as thoroughly as I can and try to think both short-term and long-term how you move forward. So I see my role on the PUC as one, being on the side of the consumer, and two, being on the side of the future of the Rhode Island economy and the regional and national economy, and on the environmental changes that these new energy sources will help us accomplish to make the air cleaner and create a better and healthier and safer environment, which not only is a good public policy, but it's a tremendous benefit to public health. So it's a complicated job. There's a lot of different elements we'll have to look at, and the commissioners, I'm sure, already do that very thoroughly. So I'll be joining a team, if the Senate sees fit to confirm me, of 2 other commissioners. I'll learn from them. I'll learn from the witnesses. I'll try to give it my best effort every day. And that's exciting for me to be able to work in this area, particularly because of the new energy production methods that are coming online now and how that'll impact our future, especially economic development, public health, public safety, and hopefully at competitive prices.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Senator, and congratulations on having serving in the Senate in the district that I represented for most of my adult life. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I never had a bad day in the State House.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think Senator Coleman, did you have some questions?
Thank you
Please.
very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Revens, for your introduction today. As a new member of the committee, I really appreciated hearing that background. So I have two questions. The first is about last year, the PUC asked the utilities to offer different payment plans due to the pandemic. What National Grid proposed at that time was like the same programs with various lengths of time for paying back the debt. So, and at that time, the PUC didn't insist on deeper forgiveness or additional tiered plans or anything like that to sort of help struggling families through this pandemic. And I guess I'm wondering your take on that decision, and if you were confirmed, if we could expect that you would, really engage with National Grid when the moment required and their proposal was not actually sufficient to meet the needs of the ratepayers.
Well, A, of course I would engage in any discussion of a matter of that importance, and B, I'd be guided by the statutory authority. So I have never practiced before the PUC. I know I haven't been there in the last 20 or 25 years. Maybe sometime before that, I could have had one little matter there somewhere along the way, but I don't recall it. So I'm not familiar with their authority in that area. I haven't studied it between the time I was recommended to you by the governor and today's hearing. So if we have the statutory authority to do it, then I would certainly look at that very carefully. If we didn't have the statutory authority to do it, then, as you know, Senator, it would require some kind of legislation to give the PUC that authority. And I'm not clear on that as I sit here before you this afternoon as to whether that's in the statute or not.
Thank you.
Sorry, I can't answer it more directly, but
No, I appreciate it. And so then let me rephrase this other question slightly. I appreciate the chair's concern with the percentage income payment plan. So understanding that it is a proposal, understanding that it is not in statute yet, is that the kind of proposal that you would support in your role as a commissioner? We know it's not law, and not yet anyway, but is that the kind of mechanism that you would see fit to be supportive of?
sure, if you enable the commission to do something, the commission, in my view, should follow the statute and follow the law. So if you pass legislation that puts a program like that in place, then absolutely, as a commissioner, I would follow what you wrote in the legislation and what you enacted. Is that helpful? I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I'm not sure as one of the three people who would make a decision about an application or make a ruling on a petition, I don't know that I can say before I've heard the case and listened to the evidence how I would rule, but I would want to be sure that we had the authority under the law to make the ruling that you're suggesting, Senator.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And Senator Revens, thank you for explaining that, because I think with the new committee members, and most of them are not attorneys, and I'm not an attorney. Ms. Coleman is an attorney. But for a lot of us, it's difficult to understand the role of PUC. One thing was explained to me last year when Mr. Grotowski was before the Senate for confirmation for PUC. That was something that was very enlightening for many of the committee members, was that we in the General Assembly have the duty to pass legislation, and then PUC has the duty to follow the statute, just as you just said, Mr. Revens. So thank you for that. Are there any Are there questions from other committee members? I'm looking on the computer screen. If you have questions, just raise your hand, and then Yes, Whip Goodwin.
Hi, Madam Chair. Hi, Jack. How are you?
I'm great, Mary Helen, how are you?
Good. Feeling great.
That's
Madam
good, you
Chair.
look great. Thank you, I'm glad to see you.
Thank you. Likewise. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, and thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to tell a little story about Jack Revens because I had the opportunity to serve because of my long tenure here in the Senate, both in Jack Revens' stint 1 in the Senate and stint 2. But in the more recent tenure of Jack Revens in the Senate, let me just tell you a quick little story. It was a few years back. I don't have all of the details, but I'm crystal clear on what Jack Revens did. And on this particular day, I'll never forget it. It was a domestic violence bill that was put together by myself and I think only my female colleagues at the time in response to a brutal, vicious murder by gun of a woman in Coventry. And we had a domestic violence bill drafted. And we put forth on the Committee on Judiciary. I don't think any of us actually served on Judiciary at the time. And we had commitments from our colleagues, some that promised that they would be there in Judiciary to vote that never showed up. Very disappointing. We had a colleague who actually told the family one thing and did the complete opposite. So incredibly disappointing. So we really saw the numbers, coming forwad. But we went to see Jack Revens, and he had already committed that he was absolutely going to support this bill. And Teresa Pavey being an attorney, myself, Senator Perry at the time, forgetting who was here, but it was all of my colleagues, I'm sure Senator Gallo, and Senator Cisnowski. We wanted this bill for his family. And Jack went into committee and he voted no. And I was like, what? He told us yes. But he only voted no in order to save the bill. He was on the prevailing side. And he was masterful. And he put his heart and soul into that bill. He did everything possible to see that that bill, became passage. He was passionate about it. He never let us down. And does this domestic violence bill have anything to do with the PUC? No, it doesn't. But it speaks to Jack Revens as a person. He's a man of his word, and he's going to do the right thing. If the utilities come before a rate on the PUC, and he doesn't think the working poor, the working middle class, or anybody in Rhode Island can afford a rate increase, he's not going to grant it. I'm telling you, he's principled, and he's going to do what's right. And Jack, I'm just going to say that PUC needs a voice for the working and the poor, and I'm really counting on you to be it. You're a decent man. I just, good to see you here today. Just wanted to tell the committee members that story because it really speaks to who you are.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you explaining why I voted no, so that then I could make the motion to reconsider and get the bill back on the table in the committee.
Right.
Thank you very much, and it's always been a pleasure to work with you and serve with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Whip Goodwin, for that. And I think that just explains that sometimes, even during the legislative process, things can be so complicated, and there is no substitute for experience, and that's one thing that Senator Revens has. He has great experience when it comes to the legislature, the legal process, and also working with charitable organizations and municipalities around the state. So thank you for bringing that story to us today, Senator Goodwin. Appreciate that very much. Are there any committee members? Yes, Senator Mendes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Revens, for this opportunity. I have several questions here for you. The first one is really would be a traditional question for a freshman to ask, because I'm very curious about this process, and I have heard from people about needing a little bit more transparency in the nomination process. So I'd love to hear from you how this nomination came to be. So that's my first question. How did this nomination come to be? Did you get asked by the governor herself? Did you apply? What did that application process look like? And the internal conversations. Let us in on the world of this process, seeing that there's a lot of a lot of curiosity and not a lot of transparency. So why don't you create that for us?
Well, I think any statement about the process generally should come from the governor's office, but I will say that I was contacted by the governor's chief of staff, and I was asked if I had an interest in this position, and I responded in the affirmative when I was asked. I thought it was, I'm aware of the PUC. I was not aware that there was a vacancy coming up with the fact that Dr. Marion Gold had asked not to be reappointed. I was honored and pleased and a little bit surprised that I was asked. And I thought about it and said, you know, that would be a great thing to do. This is a really interesting time to accept a responsibility like that. And I said yes, that I would be interested and I'd be honored. And if the governor saw fit to send my name into the Senate, I'd be pleased to serve. As to what other things were done within the administration and what other people they considered for the position, I have no knowledge of that.
Okay, thank you for your side of that. I appreciate that. So the second question I have is regarding, you know, you've kind of laid out for us a long tenure in our state house and a lot of work done. I'm curious. We are currently find ourselves in a climate crisis right now, and that is not new nor accidental. So I am curious about what in your experience of legislation or anything that you've worked on that you can signal to let us know that you've championed for clean or sustainable energy. How have you done that? And if you have not, seeing that this crisis we've known about, you know, since the 90s, what exactly would you have changed about any pieces of legislation or would have done differently?
Well, Senator, at the state legislative level, we're somewhat limited as to what we can do about clean energy. You know, if we were in California, we can pass legislation to set standards for automobiles as an example, and because we're such a big state, we can enforce it. And the automakers can't give up selling cars or trucks in California. We're a little more limited in Rhode Island. But generally in environmental areas generally, I think I've consistently supported environmental initiatives in Rhode Island. The Narragansett Bay Commission to clean up the Providence River and Bay, the improvements that have been mandated to all the municipal sewage treatment systems. And I was the principal sponsor in the mid-late 80s for the largest environmental bond issue that the state vote has ever approved. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I do have a couple more questions here. One, I'm sorry if my internet is a little bit skipping. Maybe you can work on that. Okay, let's see here. So I do have a question regarding rate hikes and your feeling on that. I know that we talked about a PIP, and I wasn't really clear definitively if you personally would support PIP, but I did understand that you would abide by legislation. So I sort of get your answer, but not quite. I'd love to hear for you personally if you support the PIP initiative, one. And then two, knowing now that in COVID, National Grid has sought fit to give 3 rate hikes in COVID. And what do you feel that in this position you can do to prevent us from continually suffering under decisions like that, if anything?
Well, first of all, to be an advocate for legislation, I'm not sure as a PUC commissioner that that's if I was confirmed in that position and sworn into that position, that's a proper role for the commissioner, because the commissioners have to hear the cases and make the decision. So I don't think the commissioner can be an advocate in the legislative process for what you should change and then turn around and vote on implementing that when there's a hearing before them. So I think I'd have to take a pass on that until the case came before me. But as I said earlier in my testimony, the number one thing is the consumer. You have to also recognize, and I know you do, Senator, and I know all of your colleagues do, the government can't put the companies that transmit gas and electric power out of business. So they have to balance the rate requests against the costs of the companies being in business. And that's a very challenging thing to do, and it's a very serious responsibility. So I want to assure you that I would take that responsibility seriously. I would be diligent in my review of any petitions for rates or anything else that come before the Public Utilities Commission, and try to do my best to decide those matters fairly and what's in the best interest of Rhode Islanders. And we're all consumers. But we need to ensure at the same time that there's an adequate supply, that there's adequate safety, that there's adequate security, and adequate delivery systems, and all of those things, as you and I know, cost money. So it's not easy to be in that position. It's easier to be where I used to be, Senator, in the legislature, where I could pick and choose what I wanted to work on, and then try to be a really effective advocate for the things that I chose to advocate for. And I'm sure you'll find that same opportunities and work on the same things. So I think if you're persuasive in your colleagues in getting things passed that we have to administer, I can assure you I'll respect the legislative process. I'll respect the laws that the General Assembly passes, and I'll try to decide any matters that come before me fairly, impartially, and in the best interests of our community.
Thank you, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Mendes. Are there any other committee members who have, yes, Senator Mack.
Hi, thank you, Chairperson Sosnowski, and thank you, Mr. Revens, for your time tonight. And I do have a few questions, and I'll try to be brief, but I will start with a story, and thank you so much for sharing your story of your time in the State House. As someone who grew up formerly low income and had parents who worked paycheck to paycheck, I know firsthand the experience of going without power, having the internet bill cut off, having the light bill cut off, and having the water bill cut off. And that is something that I grew up with, and other people who look like me have grown up with and know that experience firsthand. And there are also lots of ways that we can look at this issue in an intersectional way. Particularly, there's some really great work happening in New York City that combines public utilities with housing, looking at having more energy efficient units with refrigerators, stovetops, and including green energy in any new public housing projects. What is your commitment to approaching these utility commission decisions with an intersectional framework that includes both public housing, public health, and racial and economic impacts that families face with these decisions?
Senator, I think if there's legislation in place to link housing and utility issues together, I'd work on that very enthusiastically. I get your point. It's a long time ago, Senator, but I'm from South Providence originally. My grandmother lived in South Providence until she died in 1969. She lived with her first cousin, who was the city councilman in South Providence for 30 plus years. I know the inner city. I care about the poor and disenfranchised people, and I'll do anything I can within the law to support initiatives in those areas. I get it, and I get the importance of it, and I get the importance of having proper housing standards for construction and rehabilitation, so we can reduce the need for fossil fuels to produce energy. And I think great strides are being made in those areas, and I hope they'll continue to be. On a little side note, when I just helped two of my daughters build houses in Patuxent Village, we insulated them with wool, because it's twice as effective as fiberglass. It's a little more money, but within 4 or 5 years, you'll get the money back in lower energy costs. So I'm very sensitive to those things. And when I was in the retail liquor business, I was designing a new store to build on the property, and I was trying to make it a LEEDs certified building, but I got lucky and someone came along and offered me a lot more than I paid for it, so I took the money and made the sale. But I'm very sensitive to housing and energy consumption issues. And I appreciate your comments, and we'll be happy to look at those carefully in my job as a commissioner.
Yeah, I will just give you some homework before I leave as a former
Thank you.
teacher.
I like
Definitely look up some
homework.
of the housing. Look up some of the
homework.
housing work happening in New York. It's really powerful stuff that combines housing justice with utility justice, with racial justice, as well as being green, thinking forward. So that is your homework, Mr. Revens.
Thanks. You know, anything you get that comes across your way, feel free to send it to me. I'd love to read it. Thank you.
And thank you, Senator Mack, and also any of that information like that, I think the rest of the committee would like to have that as well. That will help us as deliberations and working on legislation and possibility of introducing legislation. So thank you for your input on that. Are there any other members of the committee? Any questions of Mr. Revens? I don't see anyone. So at this point, as I had said at the beginning of the meeting, I would entertain a motion to hold this appointment at this time. And do I see a motion?
So moved.
Okay, we have a motion and we have a
Second
second.
it,
We have a
Elaine
second.
Morgan.
Elaine Morgan seconds it.
Second as well, Madam Chair.
And who did make the motion?
Senator Pickard.
Senator Pickard. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Pickard.
As well, Madam Chair.
Okay, and we have a second by Leader McCaffrey as well. I would say we'll have a roll call vote. Mr. Clerk?
Senator Anderson.
Was that me?
Yes. Senator Anderson?
It was hard to hear, sorry. Yay. Yes.
Senator Gallo.
Yes.
Senator Coleman.
Yes.
Senator Lombardo.
Yes.
Senator Mack. Senator Mendez.
No.
Senator Morgan.
Yes.
Senator Pickard.
Yes.
Senator Sosnowski.
Yes.
Senator Dela Cruz.
Yes.
Senator Goodwin.
Yes.
Senator McCaffrey. Senate President Ruggerio.
Yes.
So the motion passes and the appointment will be held until we will reconvene in another committee and give the appointee and Lieutenant Governor and the Senate President to discuss matters further. And I thank you very much, Jack, for taking the time and the willingness to give us history today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity, and thank you, senators, for listening, and thank you for the questions. And it's very enjoyable for me to be back in the legislative process virtually for an hour at least. I spent a lot of my adult life in room 313, so I enjoyed very much the chance to be with you today, and thank you very much for your consideration.
Great, thank you. And for the public's notification, we did receive several letters, and as I had mentioned earlier at the beginning of the testimony, the letters were out of concern of the timing of the appointment, and then also we did receive a letter from the Lieutenant Governor echoing that sentiment as well. So